So the guest in the studio, first of all, I want to say that on a crisp morning, he drove across much of the state of Idaho to be here at 6 minutes after 9 o'clock, and we're at 18. That's actually up a couple of degrees. On Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Brian Smith, our guest, joining us today. Bill Colley with you as well, and he's here talking about a Medicaid expansion, or maybe not, in Idaho. First of all, welcome back to the studio.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be back.
I was going to point out, we were just having an off-air conversation. He was here back in the days of Kelly Class. You were running for political office, and you were a guest on the program, so was no difficulty finding your way back to 415 Park Avenue.
Especially with the advent of GPS.
That's a big help. Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of candidates, I guess today have that, just simply because they're covering such wide swaths of territory. It only makes good sense, especially, I think, geographically, we're the seventh biggest state in the country. So you'd need it.
It's helpful.
Well, you are here today because for some strange reason, in a conservative state, almost two-thirds who voted on Election Day approved of this expansion of this program. Of course, but they have a loosely worded, as I understand it, proposition. And so you've decided it might be time to go to court and perhaps put an end to this once and for all.
Well, I don't know if anything will put an end to
once and for all. Is
yeah,
once
and for all liberal policies. But no, my name is Brian Smith, and I'm an attorney from Idaho Falls, and I represent a fellow by the name of Brent Reagan. He is
from Coeur d'Alene.
For Coeur d'Alene, he is a couple things. He's the Republican Party county chairman for Kootenai County. He's also, I believe, the chairman of the board for the Idaho Freedom Foundation. After Medicaid expansion passed as Prop 2, we filed a petition. Now, we actually had to wait until it's not actually signed into law. So what happens is it passes by the voters, and then there's a canvassing that takes place, and the governor then issues a proclamation. Now, the governor was gone last Wednesday. I believe it happened it was maybe Tuesday or Wednesday. I believe it was Tuesday, where it was Lieutenant Governor Brad Little issued the proclamation about 4:30. We filed our petition the next day. There's a special provision of the law that allows for a direct petition filing to the Supreme Court of Idaho whenever an initiative is passed and you want to challenge its constitutionality.
Now, for people out there who would say, okay, how would it be unconstitutional? The wording of it, as I said, was very loose earlier, but how would it meet that criteria of being unconstitutional?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and there's actually good case law on this principle in the state of Idaho. First, you have to recognize that an initiative essentially is legislation that gets passed by the people and it bypasses the legislative lawmakers. But it still has to be constitutional. And so, for example, that you couldn't pass, well, you could pass it, but it would be challenged immediately. You could pass an initiative that says, for example, that if you get convicted of a felony, we're going to take away your Second Amendment rights, your First Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, and your Fifth Amendment rights. That would, or even a speeding ticket. Let's make it even easier. And so there are things that are constitutionally infirm about legislation, and that would also include initiatives. Now, in this case, whenever, and the Supreme Court says it'll treat an initiative just for a constitutional analysis, just like it does a legislative enactment. Whenever the legislature, we have three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch obviously creates the laws, and that's what happened in this initiative. Whenever the legislature creates a law, or when an initiative creates a law, it has to properly delegate the lawmaking function from the executing the law from the executive branch. What that means is that the legislature, let's just pick an example. Let's suppose the legislature wants to build a governor's mansion. We don't have one of those in Idaho, by the way.
Right, they sold it off.
They did sell it off, probably because it was just too expensive and we didn't need it. But in any event, if the legislature decided it wanted to have a governor's mansion, it would pass a law and it would give the executive branch authority to build a governor's mansion. What they couldn't say, because you have to delegate these things in a specific, definite, guided way. They couldn't say, "Hey, executive branch, you're authorized to take all steps necessary to go build a governor's mansion." They wouldn't do that. What they would have to do is they'd have to say, "Okay, we want it to be so many square feet. We want it to cost no more than X. We need it to have 5 bedrooms, 1 kitchen, a bowling alley, or whatever they wanted in there." And then once they had definite standards and limits, some people refer to these things as sideboards or ceilings, then they would pass the law, and then the executive branch would then have regulators say, "Okay, well, what colors are the drapes going to be? And what kind of carpet are we going to have? And are we going to use tile or are we going to use granite?" And so they would fill in those small things. But in terms of the standards, you just can't delegate legislative making authority over to the executive branch. And the reason for that is that the Idaho Constitution vests legislative making authority in the lawmaking body. And so if you come up with a law by the lawmakers that just shifts that responsibility to the executive branch, you now have the executive branch creating law and making law. And now you have a separation of powers argument. And that's exactly what's happened with this Medicaid initiative. So here's what it says. It says that the Department of Health and Welfare is required and authorized, those are direct quotes, to take all actions necessary to implement Medicaid expansion. Not all reasonable actions, but all actions. It doesn't say what those actions should be. And then it goes on further to say that they have this power and this mandate notwithstanding any law to the contrary. That is about as broad a delegation of authority, of lawmaking authority, that I can possibly imagine. So they're mandated and authorized to take all actions necessary, even if they're unreasonable, even if they're imprudent, notwithstanding any law. So if there's a law that's in their way, for example, let's suppose the director of health and welfare in Idaho says, "Well, look, we're going to have to implement Medicaid, even expansion for people who fit the expansion definition, even if that means that we have to cancel all other Medicaid." That's what we got to do, and we have the authority and the mandate to do it. Theoretically, they could ignore any other laws. So if that means that the executive branch then can use money from education or from roads and bridges, I mean, if they feel like that's necessary, that's what the law allows them to do. Now, obviously, they're going to say, "Oh, well, we wouldn't do that." But that's not the issue, what they would do. The issue is, how is the law drafted, and does it confer this unconstitutional, broad-sweeping, totally discretionary authority to the executive branch?
We wanted to point out quickly 9:14, and you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Magic Valley this morning. Brian Smith is our guest and has filed a lawsuit against Medicaid expansion in Idaho, which was on the ballot on November 6th and did pass with about 62% of the vote, or somewhere in that neighborhood. Bill Colley with you as well, and it's 23 right now. Telephone number if you'd like to reach our guest, 208-736-0300. That's 208-736-0300. The people who started this, and they drove that ugly green RV around the state, and
Reclaim Idaho.
Right. I saw them collecting signatures in a parking lot one day, and I didn't get approached, but I saw them collecting signatures in the first place. Seems to me that they didn't have, perhaps, a lot of good advice from a legal standpoint when they did this.
That's a great observation. Let me tell you what I've been able to piece together, what it looks like happened. There was a senator from the state of Idaho, and his name was Schmidt, and he was a Democrat. And he wanted Medicaid expansion. And so when you are in the legislature, you have access to what is called legislative services. These are people who write bills. They write the laws. Your representatives and senators, they don't have the skill set to go write the laws. They have people who do that. The people who write these laws, some are better than others. Some are brand new. Some have experience. Now, overall, they do a pretty good job at writing drafts. But what happens is that when you get a bill drafted and you get it printed, then it goes normally, before it can become law, it has to have a discussion in the committee. Then there are multiple amendments usually. You have a committee of people who are specialists at, let's say, health and welfare issues. They make amendments. They're critical. They say we need to fix this. You can't give that kind of authority to the executive branch. It doesn't cover this issue. It goes through multiple amendments, and then when it gets done in the committee, if it comes out of the committee, then it hits the floor, and then it can be amended some more, and then it ends up at the other body. We have a bicameral legislature. So in this case, if it got through the Senate, it would get to the House. Then it would go through the same process in a committee. It would be amended. And by the time you got done, you would go through what's called the sausage making process, and you would have a sausage. Well, what happened here was that this draft, this bill from Mr. Schmidt, Senator Schmidt, never got out of committee. It never even came up for a hearing. All he did was get it printed. So it never went through that crucible of critical analysis to try to make it so it would work. Well, I believe Reclaim Idaho reclaimed his piece of printed legislation. That is what, for the most part, I could explain that more if you want to know about it, but that, for the most part, is what got on the ballot. And so it never did. This is so actually, it looks to me like what was passed was simply a draft from Legislative Services without any critical analysis or thought, ended up as being now the law, let's say, for Medicaid expansion. So it wasn't reviewed that I know of by attorneys. It was reviewed by the Secretary of State. Actually, he gave that to the Attorney General. The Attorney General's opinion, when you look at it, first or second paragraph says, look, because of the time constraints that I have, that I'm working under, I don't have much time to devote to looking at this. So I'm going to give it a cursory review and just point out anything that jumps out at me. He did find a couple of things, but this was not ever evaluated in terms of the issue that we're raising.
And so you're going to have, I'm sure, at some point, a court hearing?
Yeah, so what we've done is we've filed what's called a petition for review. That got filed last week. We will now serve that on Lawrence Denny, the Secretary of State, Lawrence Wasden, the Attorney General. They will then I think they'll be required to file a response to that. And then what happens is the Supreme Court, I would anticipate, will set a briefing schedule. And that briefing schedule will then, we'll have an opening brief, they'll have an opposing brief, we'll have a reply brief, we'll have a hearing on it, and then they'll issue their decision, is how that works. Now, there's another reason, if you'd like me to get into it, why we find it unconstitutional.
Well, we've got about a minute before the break, but first of all, we should point out, just for people listening, there's an opportunity. You can stick around, I'm sure. You're not.
Yeah, I can stick around.
Because we've got about 40 minutes left to go in the program, and if there are questions or comments people may have, feel free to give us a call after the break. The telephone number again, 208-736-0300, 208-736-0300. We're at 21 on Magic Valley this morning. Brian Smith joining us in the studio. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. If people wanted to, at least, we got about 20 seconds, but if they wanted to know a little bit more about this, does the Freedom Foundation have some details up about the legal action?
Yeah, they have the petition that we filed, which lays out in allegation form what we're alleging is wrong with what's constitutionally infirm about the Proposition 2.
We've got more coming up with Brian Smith. It's 9:20. We're at 22 on Magic Valley this morning. Brian Smith in the studio with us this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We're at 23. At 9:23, Bill Colley with you as well. And telephone number, if you'd like to reach Magic Valley this morning, 208-736-0300, 208-736-0300. I kind of cut you off in the middle of an explanation a little while ago.
Well, yeah, what I was there's another. So there's two bases for our argument that Prop 2 is unconstitutional. Another issue is that when the legislature creates a law, it can't delegate its duty to another government entity. Now, I know this. When you first hear that, you say, "Well, what does that mean?" And then when you explain it, you go, "Well, yeah, that makes sense." And then let me talk about how it applies here. For example, the legislature couldn't pass a law that says, when it comes to gas tax in Idaho from now on, we're going to do whatever the Canadians tell us to do. Or we're going to do whatever the Australians tell us we ought to do. Whatever they do, that's our tax policy for gasoline. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but there's good reasons why you can't do that. In Idaho, there's good case law on this as well, that you cannot delegate to the federal government future lawmaking decisions that bind the state of Idaho. Now, the best example of that and how that applies is on the tax code. So we have federal tax law. It's like 90,000 pages. It's more complex than any human being can ever understand. And what states do, and Idaho's no different, is we adopt the federal tax code. And so when you fill out your 1040 and you get done, you come up with a number and you can apply that to your state income tax return, and it just simplifies things. Well, what happens in the legislature every year is they get up at the beginning of the session and they pass a law that says we adopt the current existing IRS tax code for this year. They do that every year. Now compare if they would say, for example, we're going to adopt the tax code from here on and out into the future. They can't do that because then the IRS or the federal government would then be making tax law for the state of Idaho. So they have to adopt existing law every year. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to, whatever the federal government does for taxes, that's what we're going to do. Well, consider how important that is. In this case, on Medicaid expansion, Proposition 2 adopted wholesale some provisions of Medicaid law on how you qualify for Medicaid in terms of what your percentage of poverty level is, and also how much cash you can have on hand and still qualify. They didn't adopt current existing Medicaid law. They adopted those sections as they just adopted them without putting the restriction as they currently exist. What this means is that the federal government could change those restrictions. They could change it and say, okay, instead of being 133% of poverty level, you qualify if you're at 100% of poverty level or 80% of poverty level. That would then increase the people eligible for Medicaid expansion. Or they might say, well, gee, we think it's okay if you have $100,000 in the bank instead of $2,000. That would increase the people eligible, and that would essentially be allowing another government, which is the federal government, to make law that is then binding on Idaho. Now, if they would have said, we adopt Medicaid law as it exists today, then if that gets changed in the future, people could say, hey, wait a minute, we voted on what we voted on. But that becomes a really big issue, especially when you look at the cost, because the way the Medicaid is it pays a basically 70 or 71% for traditional Medicaid, but as an enticement to the states to get them to buy into Medicaid expansion, the federal government said, well, we'll start off at, I don't remember what the number was, but it ends up like 90% of what they pay. What if 3 years from now the federal government says, boy, this turned out to be way more expensive than we thought. We're going to change the 90% requirement. We're only going to pay 70% like other Medicaid. Now, Idaho just passed a proposition, and when the people voted, it was 90%. And let's suppose in the future they change that, the federal government could actually triple our cost on that, and the people from Idaho would have no input. That's another reason we think it's unconstitutional.
We got about a minute and a half before the break. I don't, from a perspective of this thing, look, there are a lot of people in the legislature who say that they were opposed to it, but they're going to do their best to make it work. The lieutenant governor has said that. Unfortunately, the outgoing governor got behind it. It seems that, well, this does not have any influence on a court decision, but it almost seems a lot of people decided to wave the white flag in the final weeks before it was even passed.
Yeah, how much more time do we have to your break?
About a minute.
Okay, so you raise a really good issue. You'll hear people say, oh, the legislature's got to go in and fix it. The way this proposition's written, they got to fix it, and we're going to have to do things. We're going to have to fund it. We're going to have to put sideboards on it and ceilings. What they're really saying is, and this is intuitively they know, inherently they know that this law is unconstitutional because they know that it's a broad sweeping piece of lawmaking is what it really is. And they know that they have to go in and put some contours and some dimensions to it because it is too broad. It gives too much power to the executive branch One good example of that is this last year, the legislature passed Medicaid expansion for dental work. That is a 4-page piece of legislation. What got passed on Prop 2 was 2 paragraphs.
We'll have more coming up with Brian Smith joining us this morning, and he's talking about the lawsuit filed against implementation, I guess you would say, of Medicaid expansion in Idaho. And we're at 9:30. Todd Starnes also on the way. It's 22 on Magic Valley this morning. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. It's 9:34, and we're at 21. And he's talking with us about a lawsuit filed against Medicaid expansion in Idaho. You're listening to Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Temperature ping-ponging around. We've got 21. Bill Colley with you as well until 10 a.m. Some of the opinions we've seen on this, some people at the state level have decided to kind of be a little hands-off on it, I guess just to maybe stay out of the way of the freight train, if you will.
Well, I can tell you that since we filed this petition, I've gotten all kinds of hate responses on Facebook and other places. Which is, I mean, there's always going to be people that don't like what you do, but as their lawyer, I have the right to file that petition just as much as they had the right to put the Prop 2 on the ballot. It's really, it's a constitutional issue. We're raising a constitutional issue. I keep saying, they tell me, for example, 60% plus voted in favor of this. Now, that is an interesting statistic because 60% also vote, I think, for Brad Little as governor. So there had to be people who voted for Brad Little and also voted for Medicaid expansion, which tells me there was quite a few Republicans who voted for Medicaid expansion. It had to be that way.
And they couldn't. It wasn't a lack of being informed because the thing got plenty of coverage in the weeks in advancing to Election Day.
That's true, but I would also tell you that the information that was disseminated were just as much as outright lies in some respects. For example, the proponents of Medicaid expansion would say things like, Idaho needs to get its money back. I mean, this is a way for us to get our money back. Well, the truth is Idaho gets back $1.30 for every dollar it sends to Washington. So we're already getting 30 cents more than we get back. So if with Medicaid expansion, let's suppose it's $1.35, where does that extra 5 cents come from? It either comes from other taxpayers around the country, or it comes from printing money, or it comes from the national debt that your grandchildren and my grandchildren are going to pay for. So to go tell people, this is a great thing because we're going to get our money back, we're already getting more than our money back. So there were things that were just outright lies about the Medicaid expansion.
You'd mentioned something about the AG weighing in during the break.
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. So the AG, the Attorney General's office, they're required to look at any initiative and review it for their concerns, let's say. In this case, they reviewed it, and because they had copied this bill right from a piece of legislation, it contained this language about it being effective upon passage, which was an emergency clause. So when you have a law normally passed by the legislature, it's usually effective July 1st of that year. You can pass laws on an emergency basis, so as soon as they're passed, let's say in March, they become effective. Well, this initiative had that emergency language in there, and I think the reason is because they just copied Senator Schmidt's bill that never got it out of committee, and he wanted to become effective as an emergency, and nobody realized that, because I don't think anybody ever looked at it, they didn't realize that you don't need the emergency clause in an initiative, because once it passes and the governor issues his proclamation, it becomes effective. So the Attorney General says you don't need that language. And then there was something else. People need to be aware of this. There was a provision in order for the proponents of Medicaid expansion in the legislature to try to get it passed. They had what I call a poison pill in the legislation. It was a trigger. What it said is if the federal government ever paid less than its 90% share, that the bill would that Medicaid expansion would be null and void, is what it said. Well, the Attorney General looked at that and said, well, now wait a second. I don't know if you can say that with a straight face. And the reason is that Once you sign up for Medicaid expansion, the state of Idaho is required to fund it until the federal government gives you a waiver, which means until they let you out of it. So what that means is according to the Attorney General, is once we get hooked into Medicaid expansion, if the federal government increases its our share that we have to pay from 10% to, let's say, 30%, or stated differently, if the federal government goes from 90 down to 70, you would actually have to go to the federal government and ask for a waiver. What that would be is you'd say, gee, we'd like out of this. This turned out to be 3 times more expensive than what you told us you would pay for. Or you'd say, listen, we want to stick at our 10%. We don't want to go to the 30%. Well, the Attorney General pointed out astutely that maybe the federal government denies that request, could be denied, in which case you'd have to file an administrative appeal. Then you'd have to go to the courts. That could take years. Meantime, Idaho has to pay the 30% instead of the 10. And so what the Attorney General said is you may never win this. So you can't tell the people that if the federal government changes the percentage they pay, this is automatically going to be canceled. Well, the proponents of Medicaid, when they saw that, they took that provision out. So that is not in Proposition 2.
We've got more coming up with Brian Smith, and we're talking about a lawsuit filed against Medicaid expansion in Idaho, and we're at 9:40. It's 22 on Magic Valley this morning. Bill Colley with you until 10 o'clock on KLIX. Attorney Brian Smith joining us in the studio. We're at 9:43, we'll call it. It's 23 on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX at newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you as well until 10 a.m. today. Some questions about who was really behind all of this. The Soros family, as I understand it, they own a lot of property in Blaine County, and so they fund these things everywhere around the country, but obviously they might have a vested interest in being that they are part-time residents of the state of Idaho. Apparently a lot of money from that fortune went into promoting the proposition.
Yeah, the way I understand that happened was that there are some groups that got Soros funding. We actually looked at it at one point, and I believe, I didn't do the analysis, somebody else did, and what they reported to me is that there was about $515,000 spent paying people to gather the signatures. That's really where the hard work is, because you've got to get so many signatures in each county.
Sure.
And that was if you look back to the groups that contributed that money and paid people to stand on the corners, everybody got hit up by somebody probably. That was $515,000, and that money can be tied right back to the George Soros family.
We've got a caller, I think, looking to reach us, and what we'll do is we'll go to the telephones. Just a quick reminder, 208-736-0300. Caller, you're up next. You're on KLIX.
Well, listen, I've been very busy, so I haven't been able to listen to the whole program with Brian. I know Brian. I campaigned for him, and, we're still trying to get rid of Simpson, and because he's one of those people that doesn't seem to do anything. He just sits there and gets away with it. But why did Butch Otter endorse this? And hopefully you haven't already answered that, and I'll hang up.
Well, I'll tell you why he endorsed it. This isn't rocket science. Butch Otter used to be an active member of the John Birch Society. How do you reconcile somebody who is what you'd call a John Bircher with somebody who promotes Medicaid expansion? Well, he's changed positions. Now, why is that? I think the longer he's been in government, he's gotten a lot of support from the people who stand to benefit from Medicaid expansion. If you look at Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, they spent $70,000 on that. And look, big business, we've gotten to the point now where business is in the business of getting government money. That's what it is. So you look at the Idaho Hospital Association pitched in, the Idaho Medical Association, the emergency room physicians. You had a Blue Cross, Blue Shield. They don't want those people on their rolls, right? So let somebody else pay for them. And so Butch Otter's become the governor of big business in the state, and big business wanted this passed because they could get a transfer of wealth from the Washington, D.C. to business in Idaho. And if that's what you do, that's what you do. That's what he did.
We've got another caller. Caller, you're next. You're on the air with Brian Smith on News Radio 1310 KLIX. All right, try again, 208-736-0300. 0300. That's 2087360300. You made a reference during the break to a song by the Eagles being similar to what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, so when I got done reading the Attorney General's analysis where he says, look, once you sign up for Medicaid expansion, if the federal government changes the rules on you now that you've delegated your authority to a different, a foreign government, you have to go ask their permission to get out of Medicaid expansion. I thought of the last line of the Eagles song Hotel California, which says, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. That's kind of where we're at on Medicaid expansion, and I think that's what also makes it unconstitutional.
We have a caller looking to join us. Caller, you're next. You're on Magic Valley this morning. Go ahead.
Hi, Bill. So I listen to your radio station a lot, and I enjoy listening to you guys. But my question is on this Prop 2 was, how did we get such a large percentage of people voting for it, but not really, I just didn't feel like they were informed properly. I feel like most of them were told basically by the other side, hey, this is a good thing for Idaho, and I feel like a lot of Idahoans were duped by it.
Well, look, you've got a governor who still has high favorability ratings. He gets on the TV. He tells people this is going to bring in a lot of money. We're going to get money back from Washington, D.C. that we sent back there that we should get. It's going to boost our economy. I mean, this is such a wonderful thing. We ought to just turn all of our programs over to the federal government. You think that we'd become sort of some heavenly kingdom or something. People were sold this, saying that things that just aren't true. It's not going to. If it boosts the economy, it's based on money borrowed that our grandkids are going to pay, and so ultimately there is no free lunch. This is going to cost us. It's not going to work. You just can't take from one and give to the other and expect a miracle to happen by a thriving economy. And so people listen to that. And then the other thing they did is they absolutely did this. They wrapped this whole Medicaid expansion up in a blanket of Christian charity. And I think Idahoans are Christians. They want to be compassionate. And they're hearing what a great deal this is. And there were also a lot of people who voted for Prop 2 that also didn't vote in any other respect in the election. So you add it all up, and that's what we got.
I want to thank the caller for chiming in. And you know, that there was a lot more arrayed, I think, in this. I don't think newspaper editorials sway people much anymore because they're not reading the op-ed pages much. But the front page stories, which no longer are objective in most papers. I mean, they label it analysis, but the coverage was always the sob story. It's like, John Smith can't afford coverage, and John Smith has 6 kids, and their teeth are rotting out of their heads, but he works hard at his job, and he's been working hard ever since he dropped out of high school at 15 and went to work in the mines. Whatever the sob story is.
You raise a great point, because the Post-Register, the Sun-Times, the Idaho Statesman, whatever the paper is up north that Marty Trillhouse writes his...
Lewiston Tribune.
Yeah, all those papers were in favor of Medicaid expansion, and you could always find a hard luck story. Here's the story they weren't telling. Because traditional Medicaid expansion pays 70% from the federal government, 30% by the states, and expanded Medicaid pays 90% by the federal government, 10% by the states, there's a built-in inherent bias in favor of treating patients who would qualify for Medicaid expansion because they get paid more money. And don't kid yourselves, this is all about money. And so states that have passed Medicaid expansion have actually had people have died. There's examples of this where they were on traditional Medicaid, but because Medicaid expansion passed, this current Medicaid expansion like we have passed, people who were on traditional Medicaid expansion were actually put, I don't want to call it to the back of the line, but they didn't get the treatment that they needed because hospitals had an incentive to get paid more by treating other people. And so there were actually, because of Medicaid expansion, there were some people that didn't get the treatment that they needed because it's not limitless. There is a limit to how much treatment people can get and what we can pay for. And so because of the inherent bias in in the 90-10 versus the 70-30, those people who are in Medicaid that have been on waiting lists for things, some of them are pushed down further on the line. so that people on Medicaid expansion could be treated. They weren't showing things like that on the newspapers. They weren't talking about, like, for example, right after Medicaid expansion passed in this state, I saw somebody on Facebook that was then asking for a dermatologist who could treat her acne. That's not what this was sold as, right? This was sold as somebody who was on the throes of death, and you were having to walk over bodies to get in the emergency room if we didn't get this passed. And so I think you've raised a really good point.
We wanted to point out telephone number 208-736-0300. We're coming up on 9:52. We're at 23 on Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Brian Smith in the studio with us. He has filed a suit in hopes of stopping this thing before it actually gets its tentacles into the taxpayers of Idaho. Caller, you're next. You're on the air.
Yes. One of the things I heard was one of the legislators told his constituency that the state is already spending the money, so why not do it? And that's absolutely incorrect. And that's the kind of things, that misinformation that drives a guy nuts. Thank you.
That's a really good point. So Idaho has what's called, I don't think people realize this, we have what's called the State Indigency Fund and also the State Catastrophic Fund. It's the counties pay and the state pays. I think what happens is if you qualify for indigency care, the county pays the first $11,000, and the state then has a catastrophic fund. They're looked at like a secondary insurer, and so we already have that system in place. That system already existed. So one of the lies that was being told is about how all these people were dying because they couldn't get treatment. Well, what does that say about the state CAT fund and the state indigency fund? They were spending, I think, like $11 million a year on treatment for people. And your caller raises a really good point, and that is this. Now that Medicaid expansion, if the lawsuit's not successful and we end up with an executive branch who's allowed to do whatever they want to and create their own scenario for Medicaid expansion, do you think that the catastrophic fund and the indigency fund are going to get revoked? Idaho was the first state in the United States to pay for socialized medicine because we were the first state in the United States who said, look, if you can't afford to pay it, we'll pick up the tab for the indigency care and for the catastrophic fund. No other state did that. No other state has done that. We're the only ones to have a single payer of last resort, so to speak, by the government. We will see. If this lawsuit is not successful, if Medicaid expansion does get passed, I predict that the CAT fund and the indigency fund still won't go away.
That's the thing. I don't want to put you on the spot by saying, what is your confidence in this suit? I would assume, though, that your arguments are good ones. And from what I've heard, obviously, the way it was written, it shouldn't hold up.
So, the lawyers make arguments, and I think we have a very good case. That being said, I kind of look at myself as a point guard on a basketball team. I expect every shot that I shoot to go through the hoop. They don't always go through the hoop, but give me the ball again because I expect the shot to go through the hoop. And this is going to be up to the Supreme Court, and they'll get to decide. There'll actually be 5 people that get to decide this based on the law and the facts of the case. But I fully expect that the ball to go through the hoop.
Got about 3 minutes to go. I'll squeeze a caller in here. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Good morning. I may have missed this, but let's say you get this declared unconstitutional. What next? What replaces it?
So, yeah, that's a good question. So if the Supreme Court declares this to be unconstitutional, we've asked for a remedy that if it's already been entered into the code, that Lawrence Denny be required to take it out, and if it hasn't been entered, that he be prohibited from entering it. So it won't be the law. Then we're right back to where we were before Medicaid expansion was passed through Prop 2. It's up to the legislature, and that's where it should be dealt with. And the truth is, people will say, well, the legislature's been working on this for 3 or 4 years, and they can't get it done, and something needs to happen. Well, the remedy is you either have to pass a proposition that is not constitutionally infirm, that has sideboards and standards to it, or vote out your legislators and go get some that are going to do it. But the point is the people that typically show up and vote, those people that are typically there, they tend to vote for more conservative people in the House and the Senate. And so that's the remedy. The remedy is if you don't like it, you got to vote in some new legislators.
And if I want to thank you for the call, we've got about 90 seconds to go, and I could maybe add to this. Does something necessarily need to replace it? There's always this view that government needs to come in and take care of everything. Play mom and dad, I guess.
So you make a great point. When I ran for Congress, people had asked at the time, this was 5 years ago, they'd asked me about, what do you think about Obamacare? What would you replace it with? And I said, I know exactly what I'd replace it with. I'd replace it with a system that has fed more people, housed more people, clothed more people, brought more prosperity to more people, made more people rich today than they were in the 1200s, than the kings were in the 1200s in Europe. And that's a free market, free enterprise system. That's what we need. And to prove my point, probably have just a few seconds left, I would say, who's the oldest person in this room? We'd find somebody who were in their 80s. Invariably, they would have had like 7 to 8, 10 kids. And I'd say, how did you pay for your kids to take them to the doctor? How did you pay for their births? And they'd look and they say, we just paid for it. Today, that's unthinkable because of how expensive it is. But before the advent of what we have now, people used to pay for their health care.
There's a fellow who knows a lot about healthcare because he worked by the name of Bobby Jindal. You referenced this, and he's got a column in the Wall Street Journal today, former governor of Louisiana, where he talks about the same thing. Capitalism works. If we just follow it and we just get rid of all of the extraneous, it will pull us out of all of this.
Yeah, could you imagine how much cell phones would cost and how poor they'd work if the federal government was in charge of them?
Well, Brian, keep us posted. Obviously, it's great that you were here today. I thank you very much for driving in on what was a chilly morning. And we will take a break for 20 hours. Rush Limbaugh's program is on the way in just a few minutes. Bill Colley saying, God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 6 and 10 a.m.